Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
You're listening to another episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast, where we believe the good news about Jesus is the best news ever. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, and on today's episode, I have the privilege of interviewing Richard E. Simmons III. Richard is the best-selling author of The True Measure of a Man, Reliable Truth, The Power of a Humble Life, and more. His passion is transforming lives through gaining wisdom and applying truth in every area of life. In late 2000, he founded the Center for Executive Leadership, a not-for-profit faith-based ministry in Birmingham, Alabama. The focus of our discussion is going to be his book, Reflections on the Existence of God. It was published in 2019, but I just read it this past summer, and I found it incredibly insightful and very encouraging. So welcome to the show, Richard. I'd like to begin by asking you, what led you to write this particular book?
Well, thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure for me to be with you. First of all, this book was a labor of love. In one sense, I spent 25 years working on it, collecting the data, reading books. But I finally recognized that atheism is on the rise in America. Ironically, a couple of years ago, I saw a commercial on primetime television promoting atheism. I was shocked. And in the commercial, Ronald Reagan's son, Ron, ends the commercial by saying, "I'm a lifelong atheist and I'm not afraid of burning in hell." And so in one sense, you could say this book is for skeptics, but it's also for believers who struggle with doubt. And I've had more people tell me how the book really strengthened their faith. Because when it gets right down to it, the evidence for theism is powerful and compelling. And the evidence for atheism is weak, but most people are not even aware of that. In fact, this is pretty interesting. Pew Research and Fuller Seminary did some research on why young people raised in the church abandon their faith when they become adults. And they interviewed all these different people. And the number one response was these, when they were young and growing up, they had doubts. And they even expressed those doubts, but nobody ever answered the questions. And that's what, in one sense, I wanted to provide this for parents, but also for young people. It's 57 short essays. They're divided into sections. For instance, you have one on the presence of evil. That's a big issue for a lot of people. Meaning in life. I get into just a number of different issues. And I've had more people say it's such an easy book to read. And that's what I wanted, because so many books on the existence of God are thick and heavy and weighty and hard to read. So that was what I wanted to do. But one final thing, and I think you recognize this, one of the most significant issues in life, I believe, is understanding your worldview. That basically everybody has a worldview. And so much of your worldview is shaped by how you view God. In fact, a number of years ago, Encyclopedia Britannica published a 55-volume series called The Great Books of the Western World. And it presented the most important ideas that scholars and intellectuals have considered and investigated over the course of time. And interestingly, the longest essay was on God. And when the noted philosopher and co-editor of the series, Mortimer Adler, was asked the reason behind this, he said this, and I think this is quite interesting. He said it's because more consequences for life follow from that one issue than from any other. And so I think your view of God has the greatest impact on your worldview.
Well, I agree with that. I agree with that. You know, you have an essay in the book titled The Irrationality of Atheism.
Yes.
Why, in your opinion, does atheism not make sense?
Well, if you read the book, as you read the book, you'll see it's a massive contradiction. In fact, it's the main reason C.S. Lewis says why he changed his mind and went from being an atheist to a Christian. Because, Greg, what is the deal? It's easy to claim to be an atheist, but it's hard to live as if it were true. Because there's this massive contradiction between logic and life. The great, probably one of the most famous atheists to ever live was a guy named Friedrich Nietzsche. And he said this, he was a real straight arrow, and he spoke what he believed was true. But he said, if you reject a belief in God, and if you reject a belief in Jesus, then you have to reject Christian morality. And so that's why he contended morals don't exist, and that cruelty is a part of nature, and we're nothing but products of nature. We're part of the process of natural selection. And I just read a book on World War II, and it's amazing how cruel and evil Adolf Hitler was. But that's why Hitler embraced Nietzsche, and he justified his enormous cruelty because he saw no reason to not unleash his cruelty on the world because nature is cruel. And for instance, people say, a lot of atheists will say, well, then what is a human being? Well, a human being is an animal. B.F. Skinner says a human being, we're just sophisticated machines. But can you really live with that view? Because in the book, I spent a portion looking at issues that point out how irrational atheism is. For instance, atheism contends that love does not exist because a machine can't love. And they have to admit, then love is an illusion. The love that you think you have is nothing more than a chemical reaction in your brain. I have an essay on beauty. If there is no God, what is beauty? Well, Richard Dawkins says beauty is a chemical reaction. These are his words. It's a meaningless dance of atoms in your brain. And then what is evil? Again, atheists have to acknowledge that evil can't exist unless there is an absolute standard of goodness that's been handed down to us by a transcendent power. And if there's no absolute standard of goodness from God, evil doesn't exist. In fact, that's really what took place in the arguments that were made at the Nuremberg trials where they were trying the Nazi war criminals. And they were making contention, we were just following the laws of Nazi Germany. And the judge, a guy named Robert Jackson, says, that's not the way life works. There is a law above the law, he said. The law has to be transcendent. Otherwise, you can't say anything about evil and the evil of the Nazis. And so to think about this, Greg, to say that love, beauty, and evil don't exist is irrational. But this is a view of life that's not in harmony with reality. And so ultimately, atheism is one massive contradiction. And it's one of the number one reasons that atheists who have intellectual integrity, they change their minds.
Wow. You have so many great essays in this book, and I encourage people to read the book if they have time. There's one particular one that you wrote about the human eye. Can you share your findings about our eyes and how they challenge evolution?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the eye is incredibly complex. In fact, one eye has 130 million receptor cells. And 124 million of those are rod-shaped, like a rod. And they differentiate between light and darkness. And then 6 million of those receptor cells are cone-shaped. And this is all in one little tiny eyeball. They're cone-shaped, and they can identify the varieties of color. And so what most people will tell you who know anything about the human eye is that it's very much resembles a camera in so many ways. But then you look at a camera, as complex as it is, it's clearly a product that someone designed and produced. And then I would just say this, Charles Darwin's biggest struggle was the human eye and how it was formed. And he even acknowledged it poses a real problem for my theory. And then in that particular chapter, I talk about Dr. Ming Wang. He was a very famous, or still is, a very world-renowned eye surgeon. He was an atheist. He believed in evolution. But as he went deeper and deeper into the study of the eye, I'll probably say he was very honest, and he acknowledged there is no way that the human eye could come to exist the way it does unless somebody created it. So that's a very powerful argument, I think, for God.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, and also you mentioned in that essay that if the eye evolved, like 5% of an eye does no good. 95% of an eye does no good. It either is all completely there or it's not.
That's very strong to think about. There's no way that any organism could exist without eyes. I mean, to become human, become animals and become human. So I think that's a very powerful argument as well.
So we're often taught that all reputable scientists are atheists. Could you enlighten our audience on why that's not true?
Well, first of all, so many scientists, and I think this is really fascinating. I think so many scientists struggle with what's called willful blindness. In fact, there is an essay called Willful Blindness in the Sciences. But what you have here is that human beings, but I would say particularly scientists, have this unusual relationship with the truth, particularly spiritual truth. But what you find out about, and we all have to struggle with this, but so often we're drawn to the truth when it takes us in a direction that we want to go. But when it leads us where we don't want to go, we reject it. And so what we end up doing, we often establish beliefs because they generally express how we want life to be. And this is why the famous French mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal says, people almost invariably arrive at their beliefs not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of what they find attractive. And one of my favorite stories it's in the book. It's not a scientist. It's probably one of the greatest, philosophers to ever live, Mortimer Adler. He taught philosophy at the University of Chicago. And for most of his life, he described himself as a pagan. And then to the shock of his colleagues, at the age of 82, he became a Christian. And then he went on to live to be 98 years old. He wrote over 50 books, and I've read several of them. But he as an older man, he could reflect back on his life and his life experience. And he said, I remember back in maybe my 50s and 60s, I really thought about Christianity and possibly even becoming a Christian. He said, but I never did because I did not want to change my life. And then at the age of 82, he took the leap. And as he looked back and examined his life, Adler realized that he ultimately didn't want to change his lifestyle. He didn't want to live the Christian life. He wanted to be free to live the way he wanted to live. And this is the point I'm trying to make, is he said, the decision to become a Christian lies in the state of one's heart or will and not in the state of one's mind. It dawned on Adler late in life that his atheism was not intellectually driven, as most people probably thought. It came down to how he wanted to live his life. And one of my favorite stories on this, Greg, would be, again, C.S. Lewis. As he really began his spiritual search, he gained new insight that were clearly in conflict with his current atheistic beliefs. And then just shows you kind of what a great thinker was. He began to realize his intellect was taking him in a direction that his heart didn't want to go. His mind was being drawn to what he recognized as truth, but his heart was resistant. And he says, I later realized that I was attracted to atheism because of the moral freedom it provided. He saw Jesus as someone who was going to interfere with his life. And so too many people believe that scientists have these giant intellects and just can't believe in God. I contend, based on what Adler says and on Lewis's life, it's not intellectually driven. It's more of an issue of the heart.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.